The core paradox I explore in my paper is the mismatch between language ideology and language shift in the lowlands of eastern Ecuador. Although indigenous lowland Ecuadorians highly value speaking their indigenous language, Kichwa as a language is disappearing, and attempts toward language revitalization through the standardizing language of Kichwa Unificado are devalued. In this research, I specifically respond to claims made by both Hornberger and Habud. These pieces view language shift as a result of linguistic shame related to Kichwa, as this native language has been and continues to be associated with the lowland status. Though I agree that spoken Kichwa remains a source of linguistic shame, I argue that both the marketability of Spanish and the non-local nature of Kichwa Unificado equally contribute to this paradoxical language shift and the ineffectiveness of the current revitalization movement. I conducted my fieldwork in the lowlands of eastern Ecuador in the heart of the Amazon jungle. I spent 8 weeks conducting participant observations and semi-structured interviews, conversing with the natives concerning their opinions regarding Spanish, Kichwa, and Kichwa Unificado. In Tena, the indigenous speak their own dialect of Kichwa. Ecuadorian Kichwa possesses many varieties. This makes language revitalization through standardization difficult, as the indigenous view Kichwa Unificado as a language wholly separate from their own and are thus unwilling to accept it. It is important to note that some Kichwa do support language standardization, primarily officials who are active in the bilingual education system. However, in my research, I focus only on those opposed to standardization. This distinction is explored in more detail in Rebecca's presentation, which is next. Despite its endangerment, Kichwa remains an important source of indigenous identity, as seen through its use for interpersonal communication among close family and friends. The experience I had on one of my homestays portrays this point. I watched Giovanni, my homestay facilitator, and Yolanda converse in their native language for over 30 minutes before they even acknowledged our presence. Even though we couldn't understand what they were saying, it was clear that this language is the language of their identity. Indigenous Ecuadorians often hold their personal conversations in Kichwa, representing the role that local dialects of Kichwa possess in maintaining indigenous identity. For the indigenous, speaking Kichwa represents their Indianness to one another and affirms their relationship with one another as members of the same group. Lowland Kichwa also emphasized the importance of speaking Kichwa to be considered Runa, which means Indian, insomuch that a foreigner can become Kichwa if he but learns to speak the local language. When asked if it is important to speak Kichwa to be considered Indian, Carmen explicitly linked language and identity. She described Don Tomas, an American professor who owns and operates the field school where we stayed. He is married to a Kichwa woman and speaks their language fluently. Carmen explained, quote, "If a child learns Kichwa and speaks it well, whether he be mestizo, a settler, a foreigner, but he speaks well like Thomas. Thomas is like us. He speaks very well," unquote. When asked if Tama is Runa, Carmen responded, quote, "Yes, he is. He is totally Runa." And again, Runa means Indian. This is only one example of several I witnessed of the natives directly associating language and identity. However, despite this emphasis on spoken Kichwa, the language seems to be dying out, presenting the central paradox of this paper. Though Kichwa individuals highly value speaking Kichwa, this value is not being transmitted to the younger generation. For example, throughout my time in Ecuador, I observed a lot of code switching between Kichwa and Spanish among the young. While older natives predominantly speak Kichwa to each other, the children often code switch between Spanish and Kichwa, demonstrating the disappearance of this indigenous language as Spanish becomes increasingly utilized. Despite this obvious shift, many young Kichwa argue that they not only value, but also exclusively speak their mother tongue, contradicting many of my observations. For example, Edison said he was proud of his language and of his culture. However, when I was in their home, he and his young wife spoke only in Spanish with one another. Even as I eavesdropped around the corner for 30 minutes, they spoke in Spanish to one another. As seen by these characteristic examples, Amazonian Kichwa in Ecuador fulfills the requirements of an endangered language. I argue that lowland Kichwa is undergoing this language shift due to the market value of Spanish, as younger Kichwa prefer to speak Spanish due to its economic value. The market value placed on Spanish simultaneously undermines efforts toward language revitalization, as the symbolic value of Kichwa cannot guarantee language maintenance. In lowland Ecuador, Spanish is seen as the language of the educated, appropriate to market settings, thus possessing practical value for Amazonian indigenous. For example, Edison described how many Ecuadorian people his age do not prioritize speaking Kichwa in their homes because of embarrassment. He explained that it is seen as the language of the poor and of the uneducated. He furthered, quote, "The people who have education and success speak Spanish," unquote. This statement portrays the opinion common of many indigenous Ecuadorians, that in order to experience success, one must know Spanish, once again reiterating Spanish as a linguistic necessity dictating this language shift. These language ideologies toward Spanish ultimately contribute both to the language shift away from Kichwa and the devaluation of language revitalization through Kichwa unificado. In both cases, Spanish is viewed as a market-friendly alternative with practical application. Despite its non-local nature, Spanish is accepted by lowland indigenous due to its usefulness and association with education and success. The linguistic ideology is also reflected in ambiguous support for bilingual education within schools themselves and the outright rejection of Kichwa unificado by Amazonian indigenous. Because Spanish is viewed as the language of the educated, it is more predominant in schools, despite their bilingual nature. For example, a classroom schedule in this school allowed for only 3 hours of Kichwa instruction throughout the entire school week. Kichwa unificado is also devalued because it is a non-local dialect and thus opposes the Kichwa language ideology of the area. For example, one day Giovanni and I discussed the difference between Upaichani and Pagarachu. Giovanni explained that Kichwa people do not say Upaichani, but rather Pagarachu. Both of these words mean thank you in Kichwa. He said Rio Kichwa speakers say Pagarachu. Of Kichwa unificado, he said, quote, "It is bad. It is very bad. I do not like it at all. It is a different language and it is not my language," unquote. He furthered that if he heard another Kichwa individual saying Upaichani, he would think, quote, "You do not speak my language. You are not Indian." The above opinion portrays the sentiment common in lowland Ecuador. Many indigenous reject the advances of language revitalization through standardized Kichwa, arguing it to be too different from their own language, as it contradicts their language ideology. Despite the value indigenous Ecuadorians ascribe to speaking Kichwa, lowland dialects of this language seem to be fading away, being increasingly replaced by Spanish in everyday life, and efforts toward language revitalization through Kichwa unificado are devalued. However, lowland Kichwa seem to prefer Spanish due to its practical application, while they express dislike for standardized Kichwa, though both are non-local languages. While Spanish remains a source of linguistic necessity, Kichwa unificado is seen as alien. Both of these attitudes equally dictate the language shift and the devaluation of language revitalization currently occurring in lowland Ecuador. Thank you.
Language standardization is a much debated language revitalization technique. In the literature is rife with the debate over this topic. Some assert that the only way to effectively revitalize a language is through the creation of a standard, a universalizing variant that can be used in written form and as well as in bilingual education. Others are critical to this approach, noting that standardized languages threaten to replace the diversity of dialects of the language. Nancy Dorian, a language revitalizationist author, notes this problem. She says that as a standard meets a dialect, it often results in the conflict of ideology. This conflict in ideology, she says, hinders revitalizationist efforts. However, I pose an argument against this argument. The clash of Unificado and Tena of Napo Kichwa in the Tena area actually does create this ideological disconnect among Kichwa speakers, as Dorian noted. The language standardization provides the ideological defining of the lines between the two variants. However, because of this clash is inevitable, but a compromise between the standard and the dialect is actually impossible. Further, I suggest that a compromise may not be necessary, for as people assert their dialect over the standardized one, they are contributing in a way to the maintenance of their own language without the use of standardized Kichwa. My project is also, like Kelsey's, based on a project, 2-month field study in the region of Tena, Ecuador. I conducted semi-structured and informal interviews speaking to local Napo Kichwa speakers, both those in the bilingual ministry as well as those not in the bilingual ministry. My information gathering techniques also included participant observation, which was included but not limited to observation in a local bilingual school as well as a local Spanish-speaking school. I want to expound a little bit more on the background Kelsey gave of Kichwa Unificado. As she said, Kichwa is a disappearing language throughout the area. As it disappears, well, in the 1990s, a board of indigenous Kichwa-speaking members created Kichwa Unificado, this standard variant of Kichwa. Its purpose was to revitalize the language throughout the country. It's important to note that it was based on the highland variant of Kichwa, specifically the Chimborazo dialect. And it's also important to note that the greatest linguistic difference within Kichwa is this difference between highland and lowland dialects. So as you can see, here are the highlands, and these are all the highland dialects. These are the lowland dialects. And where I worked was in Tena, a lowland area. So this, the difference that Kichwa Unificado presents will present a problem for the implementation of Kichwa Unificado in the area. Further, as Kelsey mentioned, bilingual officials, so teachers and those in the ministry, are actually using this standardized variant as a spoken language, though it was only intended to be a written language. As these people are using this variant in spoken Kichwa, it's presenting a kind of problem to other Napo speakers because of the foreign nature of standardized Kichwa. I want to, I guess, expound on the example Kelsey gave of the linguistic preference for two words, which will display this ideological disconnect that Dorian talks about. And it's the words pagarachu and upaichani. Just a quick review, pagarachu and upaichani both mean thank you, though pagarachu is in Napo Kichwa, and upaichani is in standardized Kichwa. So as Kelsey mentioned, I'm not going to go over it in quite as much detail, Giovanni expressed his aversion to unificado, saying, people who speak it and use the word upaichani are not my language. They're not Runa, they're not Indian. it's not our tradition. And he would ignore or look down on anyone who used that term because it's not Kichwa to him. It's interesting to note a contrast to this word, to this situation. A bilingual official, when I interviewed him, I thanked him in using the word pagarachu. He corrected me in this use of the term, saying pagarachu is not really a Kichwa word. It comes from the Spanish root word of pagar, which means to pay. And so the purely Kichwa way to say thank you is upaichani. Now Nancy Dorian outlines this ideological disconnect in reference to the idea of purism, and specifically two ideas of purism. And that's of authenticity versus historicity. And both these people display each version of purity. Giovanni, on the one hand, supports the idea of authenticity, which defined by Dorian is the colloquial language, is what people speak. It's, I guess, the colloquial language as experienced by its native speakers, and it derives its authenticity from the fact that people grew up speaking it and they know it. Contrastingly, the bilingual official is subscribing to the idea of historicity. The word that he supported, upaichani, is devoid of any Spanish influence or Spanish root words. So according to Dorian, it is hearkening back to a standard language, which is Kichwa unificado, as well as a kind of antiquated pre-conquest Kichwa, which also is devoid of Spanish words. Dorian says that this conflict she observed is detrimental to the survival of a threatened language, opting for a compromise to preserve the language. She says, "It may prove the wiser course to accept considerable compromise rather than to make a determined stand for intactness where threatened languages are at issue. If a language survives, after all, it has a future." However, this is where I depart from her model. Though I only shared one example because of time, the situation I explained before is not a rare situation in Tena. Most people I interviewed exclaimed how different Kichwa was. Kichwa unificado was from their own dialect, Napo Kichwa, saying it's so difficult to learn. It's Highland Kichwa. One woman even expressed her aversion to it in this way. She said she didn't want to send her child to a bilingual school for fear that her child would come home speaking unificado and use it in the home. Though Kichwa unificado was helped to preserve Kichwa language across the country, the Highland nature of Kichwa unificado, as well as many speakers' allegiance to their own dialect, make unificado's success as a universalizing language improbable. So overall, Kichwa unificado is creating this division between Napo Kichwa speakers, those involved in the bilingual ministry, and those not involved in the bilingual ministry. This division creates boundaries between the two languages, and both sides, as I explained previously, fiercely defend their respective languages and language ideologies. The perception of most Napo Kichwa speakers I interacted with is that it is too different from the dialect they speak to accept. In this way, I propose that it is currently impossible to combine the two variants of Kichwa, as Dorian suggests, for each side is too adamantly opposed to another. Each group asserts their variant over the other on grounds of purity. And the two sides, and Dorian even recognizes this, seem irreconcilable. However, I argue that this might be acceptable. The ideological conflict created by the implementation specifically of Kichwa unificado may not be a cause for language disappearance, as Dorian asserts. The adamant responses and reactions against and for Kichwa unificado draw the boundaries clearly between these two Kichwa variants. And most of the people that I interviewed were similar to Giovanni in that they were adamant in their rejection of unificado. In this way, language standardization poses no current threat to Napo Kichwa, though through the unintended consequence of providing an ideological conflict. I want to just suggest that it may, in fact, that this ideological conflict might in fact help with the preservation and maintenance of the current Napo dialect. For as many Napo Kichwa speakers promote their dialect over Unificado, they are engaging in maintaining their own dialect. Thank you.
Over the course of 10 years, a grassroots group of rural Kichwa Ecuadorian farmers transitioned from selling their dried beans locally to dedicating the majority of their cocoa beans to producing a line of artisanal chocolate. They exported this chocolate all around the world. I wondered, what outside sources did these farmers go to for resources and help? What was their motivation for making these changes? The answer to these questions and more were discovered during the 8 weeks I spent in the Amazon jungle of Ecuador conducting ethnographic research in the summer of 2013. This grassroots group of Kichwa farmers transcended traditional development categories and were able to make these changes by successfully blending key elements typically associated with two approaches of bottom-up development or community-driven development. Through using this strategy, these Kichwa farmers formed the KALLARI Association, a sustainable community cooperative, which helped them to make progress in saving their rainforests, increasing their income, and preserving their cultural heritage. Using this approach, the Kichwa farmers were able to meet their unique needs in a way that other forms of development couldn't. Development can take on different meanings. Development can take on different meanings depending on the context in which it is used. In the most basic form, development refers to growth, progress, and advancement. While in its broadest sense, many see development as, according to Berger, the process by which poor countries become richer or try to do so, and also by the process by which rich countries get still richer. In recent years, there's been an increasing shift in development away from top-down, westernized, and donor-driven development, which was common during World War II, to bottom-up, community-driven development. Two of the different bottom-up methods, endogenous development, ED, or development from within a community, and participatory innovative development, PID, or development that supports local community innovation, individually seek to improve the livelihoods of the rural poor using distinctly different methods. Typically, bottom-up development is carried out using one single method. This type of categorical thinking is problematic as it limits the strategies that can be used in development work. Recognizing this problem, South African development scientist Bridget Letty attempted to support a working synergistic relationship between ED and PID. However, Letty recently stated, efforts to establish strong linkages between the two in South Africa did not prove effective. Although efforts to combine these methods in other areas of the world have not been effective, the KALLARI has been effective in blending key elements of these two approaches. The differences in the approaches of ED and PID are outlined in this chart. Although in my full thesis paper, I detail how the KALLARI has been successful in blending all the key elements in both methods, in the interest of time, I'll narrow my focus on how the KALLARI has blended one of the elements of ED and PID. In the distinguishing features category that's highlighted in yellow, ED focuses on preserving the cultural characteristics of a community, while in contrast, PID focuses mainly on building the farmer's capacity to innovate. Before I show how the KALLARI combined elements from these supposedly distinctive approaches, it's important to understand what motivated these farmers to make these changes. In the Napo region of Ecuador, where I conducted my field work, noted by the red oval in the right map, the exploitation and pollution of indigenous lands began in the 1970s when large deposits of crude oil were discovered in the northern Oriente. Concerned by the looming threat of destruction to their rainforest, over 15 years ago, a group of Kichwa farmers formed a grassroots group to try to preserve their rainforests and improve their livelihood. Many of these subsistence farmers feel a deep spiritual connection to the land and a responsibility to help preserve the rainforest for future generations. The KALLARI successfully combined elements from the supposedly distinctive approaches of PID and ED by first focusing on preserving their cultural characteristics. Through speaking with the people as I worked alongside them in their chakras or farms, I learned how they accomplished this by concentrating on preserving their rainforests, increasing their income, and preserving their culture. I also saw how they incorporated elements of PID by experimenting with innovative ideas in creating a sustainable community cooperative. When I first visited the KALLARI offices, I met Carlos, an indigenous man who is their general coordinator. He explained to me that American biologist Judy Logback approached the KALLARI, or approached the grassroots group of farmers 16 years ago when she asked how she could help them. The Kichwa people responded by suggesting the formation of a community cooperative to help them increase their income without destroying their rainforests. The Kichwa farmers chose the name KALLARI for their cooperative, a Kichwa word that comes from ancient times and means both to begin and from the past. The farmers sought to preserve their cultural heritage by carefully choosing a Kichwa term for the name for their cooperative and by seeking help from Logback in preserving their rainforests. In order to make progress in preserving the rainforest, the people needed a way to increase their income to resist the lure of selling their land to oil companies. Improving upon the cultural tradition of growing cacao was the idea of the KALLARI Directive Board and Judy Logback. KALLARI farmer Cesar Dawa explained that although cacao had grown wild on his family's chakra for many generations, they lost much of their crop to disease. Cesar described to me how the KALLARI brought in agricultural experts to train them on how to effectively plant, transplant, and graft their trees, which in turn would bring them a higher yield and profit. Further, he explained, before we joined the KALLARI, I had no tools. I only used my machete. The tools that the KALLARI gave me, gloves, pruning shears, and a long pole pruner, are so important because it makes it so even my daughters and grandchildren can help me farm with the tools. By bringing in experts to teach the people improved farming methods, the KALLARI was able to help them increase their yields and their income. The next stage of development came in the response to the KALLARI farmers asking for change in how their cacao was sold. Traditionally, let me just see. Okay. Traditionally, the beans were sold to brokers who were part of a chain of 3 to 7 intermediaries, with each increasing the price of the beans to make a profit. Cesar explained, the intermediaries cheated a lot. They bought our cacao for a very low price, and they cheated us when they weighed the cacao they stole from us. KALLARI leaders solved this by bringing beans from the farmers, by buying beans from the farmers, as you can see in the picture, and transporting a large volume of bags of dry beans to the coastal ports. They were immediately rewarded with the reward of higher price for their beans. The final stage in preserving the cultural heritage and increasing the income occurred when the KALLARI leaders began looking for a way to retain more of the profits from the production of their quality cocoa beans. The KALLARI Directive Board worked with Logback to move from exporting their beans as a commodity to manufacturing their own line of high-quality chocolate bars. They brought in experts again, this time in the areas of food manufacturing and chocolate making, to train the KALLARI leaders in the art of making artisanal chocolate bars. These stages of growth, using the endogenous method of development and elements of preserving the cultural characteristics, brought the Kichwa farmers from selling cocoa beans locally to selling organic chocolate bars worldwide. The participatory innovation characteristic of building the capacity of farmers to innovate was used by the KALLARI in searching for new ways to supplement income of the KALLARI farmers in the off-season. Due to the cyclical nature of cacao, cocoa beans are harvested during a 7-month period, leaving the farmers with 5 months of little income. The innovative ideas of KALLARI leaders implemented such as offering homestay visits in the homes of approved KALLARI members for tourists that were interested in learning more about the KALLARI way of life, and other innovative ideas such as the production of chip chocolate, as you can see on the left, small discs like chocolate chips, and the sale of organic fruit. As you can see, the girl that's holding a chirimoya fruit, they encourage the members to sell those in Quitos, all different kinds of fruits that were grown in the chakra. Now, this innovative, creative way of PID thinking is helping the coyote to solve ongoing issues they have with income generation, which will help them continue to be a sustainable community cooperative. By transcending traditional development categories typically associated with endogenous and participatory innovation development methods, the coyote has been successful in blending elements from each method. In doing so, the coyote has helped the Kichwa farmers like Cesar and Magdalena de Agua make progress in saving their rainforests, preserving their cultural heritage, and increasing their off-season income in a way that couldn't be done with one method alone. Through analyzing the success the coyote has had with implementing this approach to development, new understanding may influence how development in rural areas will go forward in the future. Thank you.
Pedro had been a very helpful guide throughout the whole day. He was patient as we continually fell down in the river, helped us pull boots out of quicksand, and warned us about dangerous plants throughout the hike. Being a guide to about 10 college students from the United States on a hike through the jungle was probably not his idea of a fun day, but he loved educating us about his home and telling us stories. When we set up camp at our platform in the jungle and night started to fall, Pedro lit candles for us and began to tell us stories about how things used to be when his family, along with everyone else in the community, lived a jungle life. He told us of hunting in the jungle and using rocks for pillows and leaves for protection from the ground. They would catch animals for meat and eat off the fruit of the land. Midway through his storytelling, he paused and asked us if we heard a noise. At first, none of us heard it, but as we listened carefully, we could hear the faint sounds of a man screaming in the distance. Pedro explained to us that this was the dueño de la selva, or in English, owner of the jungle, crying because there were strangers in his domain. He continued to explain that the dueño knows when someone who doesn't belong has entered, and that was us. I soon came to realize this situation was a good metaphor of what was happening in the area, that it wasn't just the jungle being invaded by Westerners like us, but the whole area of Tena and its outlying communities. Similarly to the dueño who cried out when strangers were intruding, the community was in its own way protesting against the incoming influences. In the 1970s, Highway E45 was built, conjoining the already existing highway system in the highlands to the Napo province, and bringing with it many outside influences. These Western influences grew stronger, but so did the resistance to them. This resistance is especially evident through the cultural practices of language, land, and Chicha. Many evidences of globalization were present throughout Tena. Spanish was the main language spoken in all parts of town. The older generation made up the people who spoke only Kichwa. They, along with the people who lived in the area before the highway was built, would always speak of how things used to be, how they grew up only speaking Kichwa. Now people grow up speaking Spanish, or possibly some Kichwa, but it is no longer the dominant language. As I walked around the town itself, I saw American celebrities and advertisements, children watching American and Japanese cartoons, brands from the United States, and English being spoken. Even when I went into people's homes, pictures of American celebrities were displayed on the wall. On the bus and in the street, I heard people listening to top 20 songs from the States, like Justin Bieber, James Blunt, and Jennifer Lopez. The evolving economy of the area also shows the magnitude of globalization. I was able to learn details of how people used to live by listening to the stories told by the older generation. All the families basically lived off chakras, family plots of land where food is grown, and hunting. Now the city is crowded with shops of various kinds, restaurants, people selling their good on the streets, and even a supermarket. I spoke with people who told stories of how they weren't able to live off the land anymore and had to leave Tena to find jobs in Shell or Puyo. People now need to find ways to earn money so they can send their children to school, buy clothes, and buy supplemental foods and supplies like soap. Because of this, they can no longer simply live off the land. I am mostly going to work off theories from Gubernau, Nederveen Pietersay, and the Comrades. As these theories arise in my findings, I will address them. While staying at the home of a very nice man, I was able to interview him fairly often throughout the day. When night came, it was starting to get late, and our conversation began to wind down. I could tell he wanted to go to bed, but then I told him that I was starting to learn Kichwa. He then started quizzing me on what I knew and correcting phrases I said incorrectly. The next night, as we were winding down again, and I was very ready to go to bed after a long day in the chakra, he said, "Why don't we do 15 minutes of Kichwa practice, then we can go to bed." Another experience was with a young man who was a member of the congregation where I attended church services. As my colleagues and I met with him, he was very prepared with Kichwa lessons, and whenever we tried to interview him, he made us do it in Kichwa. These experiences demonstrate how much the people of Tena love their indigenous language and are eager to have others use it so they can stay strong in the language. Similar to what Gubernau argued about Catalan, these people still use this language as a familial one. Also, by instructing others to speak Kichwa, it is one way they can have mastery over their changing world, as the comrades argued is part of resistance. Many parents are still teaching their children Kichwa. One woman who worked at the field school, when asked what language her and her family spoke at home, responded very bluntly, "We speak Kichwa in our house." I had heard that people would repeatedly say this, but not actually speak Kichwa in their homes with their children. However, I stayed overnight with 2 different families and saw that they did actually speak Kichwa in their homes with their children. One home had 3 children living there with their mother. All of them spoke to their mother and each other in Kichwa, but Spanish to us. The youngest was 5, and he could only speak a bit of Spanish, but mostly spoke in Kichwa to his mother. The other home had a multiplicity of children, but they all knew Kichwa and spoke it amongst each other. The only time I heard Spanish at either of these homestays was when the families were speaking with me. In addition to these experiences, there was a Kichwa woman who came to the field school to teach pottery, and she brought her son. He was 9 and had only learned Spanish through school, which was obvious because he could not speak it very well. She told us that she only spoke Kichwa with him, and that was evident whenever I saw them together. These are yet more demonstrations of how Kichwa is a familial language. The value Kichwa people place on the land can be seen by those outside the culture. One example is seen from in a quote from a Colono man, meaning he was not of indigenous descent. He had married a Kichwa woman and now lives in the area. Speaking of his wife, he said, "There are certain customs that she can't leave behind. For example, she really likes maito, tilapia, meat from the forest. She likes all that her parents have shown her. Now she can't leave." This can be seen in Pedro's stories as well, about how things used to be when they lived off the land. Living off the land and respecting it is one of the key roles in Kichwa people's lives. One way people keep a tie to the land is through the cultivation of chakras. A chakra is a plot of land in which families work together to grow food. In relation to her chakra, one woman told me, "Our cultivations in our chakra are without chemicals, natural. On the other hand, what comes out of the vegetables of the Sierra, they have a lot of chemicals. Because of this, the people that live in the city get sick a lot. So because we know this, we don't buy a lot of that. We buy more things to live, like oil, salt, sugar. We buy soap because it's necessary to buy it for our house. Since there is food in our chakra, that same food we have." Working a chakra is hard and tedious labor, especially when many food items are shipped in and could simply be bought in town. However, the people I spoke with were very proud of the food they grew themselves. The comrades presented a scale of resistance in volume 1 of their book. In different areas of the Kichwa lifestyle, there are varying levels of resistance. This is one area in which there is a very strong resistance. They are not adding in Western influences to that sphere of chakras. Chicha, the traditional drink of the area, is a key component. It is made from yucca, and a small part of sweet potato is used to ferment it. The drink does not have a high alcohol content unless it sets for a while. All the drinkers at the field school drink it, as well as the families from the homestays. It is served out of a communal drinking cup at all major social events, and whenever someone comes as a guest to a house. It is very much a social drink and is a small way of group resistance because it knits them together in maintaining the tradition of drinking chicha. On a homestay with one couple, they told me that in order to be Kichwa, you have to drink chicha. Along these same lines, a woman who worked at the field school said, "We also drink chicha. We never lack it in my house. We never lack it any week. Now I am working here, so I haven't made it. It's been almost 2 weeks that I haven't made it, but I have left a small jug there for my husband. I have left it. My husband finished it, so now tomorrow afternoon, my daughter Nellie is going to make chicha for her dad." This is such a vital part of their culture, and they keep it in their private sphere. The drink is not commercialized, and it is always given to guests when they are received. Similar to Gubernau's theory, they keep their traditions privately and in public except the globalizing influences, such as drinking Coca-Cola in town. It is a form of hybridization, as Nederveen Pietersay put forth in his book. However, they are not mixing 2 things into one, but rather living 2 areas simultaneously. As we can see from the evidences I have presented, globalization is occurring in the Tena area, and indigenous Kichwa people are finding small ways to maintain their traditions while adapting to this more Western lifestyle. Similar to some of the theories put forth by Gubernau the Komrovs and Nederveen Pieterse, the people in the communities surrounding Tena are trying to navigate how to balance these different spheres. They are doing this by accepting parts of the globalized culture in business, school, and other such parts of lives, but continue to live traditionally in the private sphere with language, land, and Chicha. Thank you.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and I am going to do what you're never supposed to do, and that is start with a handful of apologies. I have a class I have to teach at 11, so I am basically going to drop my comments on you and run away, which is maybe not fair, but in any event, that will be the approach. The other is I'm suffering from a cold, so I will try really hard not to cough through my conversation here, much like I tried not to cough through your talk. So in any event, those are my apologies. With that out of the way, let me get into this. I thought that all 4 papers were fascinating. I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective, but my sense is if the goal of this whole project is to give you a sense of what it means to be an anthropologist, each of you succeeded. I thought that the ethnographic work seemed to really come through. I thought you did a great job of listening and interviewing and trying to make sense of what you were encountering. And so I don't know if this is the point to this whole project, but if it is to give you a firm foundation from which you could go on to be an anthropologist, I think that you've all succeeded in that regard. I think that you've done some great work and have a good base to build on in the future. In addition to that, I think you've done a nice job of incorporating theory into the project and framing your question in a way that engages with the broader literature. So I think in that regard also you should feel good that you've been very successful. Let me talk about your papers sort of thematically now and then get into the individual papers and raise some questions. So thematically, I think that each of the papers has either explicitly or implicitly behind it 2 things. They're really the same thing, 2 sides of the same thing. One is globalization, which is the overt framework of Rachel's paper, but also I think is implicit in all of your papers. The fact that a group of people who were more or less isolated are less isolated, and there are consequences to that. And here I think that the star of the story that none of you really bring out, except for I think Rachel does a little bit, is the construction of Highway E45, which, if I'm understanding the papers in their collective effort, that's sort of the moment where the people that you spent time with more or less became more in contact with the rest of Ecuador and the globe. So that I think that in the end, each of the stories could be more explicitly about questions of globalization. That, however, as I'll point out in a minute, is a mixed blessing. I think that there's some trickiness to the notion of globalization, which I'll get to in a second. So let me start. I'm going to go roughly in the same order that you all spoke. So Kelsey and Rebecca, you basically took on the same question, and that is, how are the people, the target and intended audience of Kichwa Unificado receiving this? And I think you both did a great job of framing this in a way that we can see some real tension in this program. Kelsey, your sort of dichotomy of looking at this was the difference between a market value that favored Spanish versus, and I'm just coining a phrase here, an identity value, a need to speak Kichwa as a way of maintaining a native identity, or I don't know if native is the right word, but an authentic identity. Whereas Rebecca, I think you did a similarly interesting and fruitful dichotomy that came out more in your paper, I thought, than in your presentation, and that was this contrast between historicity, what is the true roots of the Kichwa language, as opposed to authenticity. How are people speaking it today? Which, and I think you were absolutely right to say they're both versions of a pure language, but they are in conflict. And that this tension is being played out by the reception of the whole Kichwa Unificado program and the bilingual ministry. And I thought both of those were great ways to frame it. So I have questions about this, but I'm going to get to that in 1 second. Then I want to skip, I know Rachel spoke last, but I want to talk about your paper next, because you then also take up this question of resistance, but focus more on the globalizing effect of late 20th, early 21st century economics and so on. And I thought that it was very smart to look at the handful of things you looked at, the language, the ties to the land, the chakras. Am I saying that right? Chakras. And then I thought that the most evocative of the examples was Chicha, which again in the paper came out more than I think than here, but the fact that Chicha is this really tightly tied to identity, but it's also flexible. One can become part of the community by embracing this drink, and I thought that that was really evocative. All right, so I've purposely left Kathy's paper last because what I really would like to see happen in the 2 or 3 minutes I leave you to do this is really, what I would have really loved is if this had been a collaborative paper, because in many ways you're taking up exactly the same issues, but coming at it from different angles. And the reason I left Kathy's paper to last is because I think yours would kind of make a good thesis, which is this question that really came out when I read paper after paper after paper, and that is, how is there a blending going on? So in other words, each of you kind of has a framework of binaries. There's the global influence and the local. There's the official Kichwa language and the unofficial, and so on. And then, of course, there's the 2 development projects. And I think that, Kathy, your sense that there is a blending going on would make a really great framework for a collective 4-person paper, because each of you has, I think, really great insights. And the only way I could make sense of them all one on top of the other is to say there's something else going on here that is being, so that the people that you're talking about, and I don't know actually the term, I don't want to say Ecuadorian, but these, but the Kichwa, but anyway, but I'm sure that there's distinctions within this. But in any event, the people that you all spent time with, they're up to something. And I think that for the various different angles you come at it would reveal what that something is. But my suspicion is this, and it gets me to hear kind of the broader questions. The first is, I kind of wanted collectively, if you could clarify a little bit better, what exactly is being resisted in the broader sense? So I think we know in the specific sense when we say Kichwa unificado on the one hand, or on the other hand we could say Justin Bieber, the globalizing impact of American culture, something along those lines. And frankly, I'm in favor of resisting Justin Bieber, but that's probably a whole other topic. But in essence, resistance is happening, but there's also a kind of embracing going on, right? The whole notion that Kelsey brought out of Spanish being seen as more educated, as being the market language. And I thought that tied in very nicely with something that Kathy brought out in your paper, the fact that the Kichwan people are trying to get out and around, trying to bypass the middlemen that are stealing from them in the it seems to me you'd have to speak Spanish to do that. That would be that there's a utility to the language, and so this is what I think Kelsey means when she's talking about Spanish having a market value and so on. So I think that both things are going on. There's got to be some sort of strategic or utilitarian things going on that are being discussed and thought through and happening at the same time. The other player that never really showed up in any of the papers, but I actually think has to be really important to this story, and that is the role of the Ecuadorian state. Because I think it matters that there's a bilingual ministry prescribing the official form of resistance to globalization. And that is, it's self-homogenizing, but in a particularly nationalistic way. And I know only a few things about Ecuador, but I know that at least the contemporary political climate is leftist and is therefore in this overt way anti-Western and so on. So that it seems to be very important that the bilingual ministry be historically authentic, because it's got to be part of a larger project of recovering a pre-colonial Ecuadorian identity. And that seems to me also part of what's going on, and would of course run into conflict with the story that Kathy's telling, which is this story of development from indigenous sources and being, in other words, it seems to me that Kathy's telling a story of what Kelsey would call, Rebecca would call authenticity versus historicity, something along those lines. So in other words, I think that what would sharpen all of the papers and make it a wonderful collected work would be working out what is being resisted. Is it a global influence or is it a state influence? And if it's a state influence, Is the global influence actually to the advantage of the indigenous people? In other words, is the state the middleman that's getting cut out? You know, something along those lines. So I think clarifying those things would be really helpful. And in this regard, the one theorist that I thought might be useful is Anthony Giddens, who encourages us to think of structure as both rules and outside influences sort of shaping us, but also resources that the people that you're talking about can take advantage of for whatever their purposes might be. Okay, that has to be my last word, and I have to go teach a class. But anyway, I do want to say congratulations. I thought they were all really great papers, and I enjoyed reading them very much.
Thank you so much, Grant.